Hey everyone, I'm Teresa. Welcome back to my channel, Lost My Thread. Today I'm going to be showing you how you can make your own sheared bodice jumpsuit. So the whole idea behind this jumpsuit is I wanted to try and think about jumpsuits that I could make that would be easy to get on and off. I hate fussing around with jumpsuits that are really awkward to kind of finagle yourself into and get out of. This is the easiest jumpsuit that I have ever put on in my life because it's just shearing elastic, and I even added elastic onto the straps. This just glides down my body, over my hips, off really easily and back on again. No fastenings, no fuss. Really easy, really comfortable. It is also just so fun and playful and flirty and just way more nice and, high end than I was expecting. When you're dreaming up a hack, you're thinking, it could go either way. And it definitely went the way that I was hoping, the way that I was envisioning, and even better than I hoped. And I really am excited to show you guys how you can make this for yourself. I did hack this from a existing free pants pattern, so it's the Cass Wide Leg Culottes from fabricstore.com. I will of course put links to that down below if you want to use the same pants pattern that I had, but any elastic waist woven pants pattern will be absolutely fine. So if you've got one that works for you, I say go for that one. If not, this is a free download. Get on it, check it out, and it will work well. I can say from my own experience, it works for this project. A couple things I will mention about this particular Cass pants pattern is that it does not have a huge amount of ease in the hips. It just has 2 inches of ease, which I did not realize until after I made this jumpsuit. So in future, I would definitely recommend sizing up one size on this pattern. You can look at it and make a decision for yourself, but for me, I think it's just a little bit more comfortable having closer to about 4 inches of ease over the hips. The other thing is that this pattern comes with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I wanted to make this whole jumpsuit with French seams throughout, so I added a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the end before I cut out my fabric to make a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So just bear that in mind, make adjustments if you want to do the same. So I'll talk you a little bit through the designs of this. The bodice is literally just a rectangle of fabric that I've sheared all along it. So it's fitted from, I've got this just under the underarms is where I want it to finish. And it goes down to just around what I would say is kind of my high hip, just where my tummy starts to kind of go in, so the fullest part of my tummy. And that for me, I think is the most flattering point for it to hit on me, but you can definitely make this whatever height that you want it to, but just bear in mind, obviously you're then gonna have the trouser starting. So what I ended up doing is I made a muslin of the trousers first, just so I could see where that point was on the trouser, so where I wanted the trouser to end, just here. And I added 5/8 of an inch seam allowance to that. And I measured from this point up to here. I talk about a little bit in the tutorial, but just so you can visualize what I'm talking about. It is just straight across then, all the way around, and I've got these straps. So these are ruffled straps. Like I said, elastic in there. So what I've done is I've got an elastic channel going through the center, and it creates this really cute ruffle effect, which covers my bra strap perfectly, makes it really comfortable, gives me just a bit of support without being too restrictive, and like I said, makes it even easier to take this jumpsuit on and off. If you've never done any shearing before, or you don't feel completely confident with doing shearing, I'm not getting into all of that in this video because it would just be a little bit too overloaded, but I did do a full video just on the basics of shearing, including my top tips for it. I'll put a link to that up here so you can check that out before you watch this video, or if you get a little bit stuck when you're trying to make your own jumpsuit. But enough preamble, guys, let's just get right to making this jumpsuit. So to start with, I've got my front and back leg pieces cut out and ready to go. I have 4 pocket pieces because I am including pockets. You can always omit them just to make this all a little bit easier, but I want pockets on my jumpsuit. So I've also got some rectangles here. One of them is the bodice. The way I worked out the size of my bodice rectangle is I measured my body from just under my armpit, which is where I wanted the top of the bodice to be, down to, like, I would call my high hip area, but basically right just under the fullest part of my tummy, because I know that's the most flattering place for the shearing to end on me, but all this is very much up to you where you want it to go. But that for me was 11 inches. And then I added 1 1/4 inches to that for the seam allowance at the top and the bottom, so that ended up with a 12 1/4 inch length of the piece. For the width, I wanted it to be 1.5 times the widest part of my upper torso. So for me, that's my bust, which is 38 inches, but it might be your tummy or your high hip depending on your proportions. But just work out what is the widest part of where you're gonna need the shirring to go over. Multiply that times 1.5, and then you need to add your seam allowance again, so 1.25 inch to that. This fabric is actually 55 inches wide, and I didn't think that that little difference of 4 inches was really going to make a difference on this whole gathered bodice, so I just went with the width of my fabric, 55 inches. Depending on your measurements or the width of your fabric, you might need to piece a couple of pieces together to create the full bodice. If you're going to do that, I would always recommend making them equal size so that you can have side seams rather than having multiple seams in odd places on the body. And then I've got 2 rectangles for my straps. I wanted to make sure that these could gather in nicely, so I started off by making these twice as long as I wanted the strap to be. But in the end, I actually preferred them to be 1.5 times the length of my strap. But I'll show you what that looks like, the difference between the two, and that will help you make a decision for yourself. So I measured the distance over my shoulder from just under my armpit from the front to the back, which is where I want the top of my bodice to end. And for me, that is 10 inches. So what I did is I multiplied that by 2 because I wanted the straps to be 2 times longer than the length of the strap. And then I added a full 2 inches for seam allowance, just to give myself a little bit of wiggle room in case it felt a bit different when it was on my body. So I cut these pieces out 22 inches long. I wanted a decently wide strap because I wanted to make sure that it was going to cover my bra strap. So I got pieces that were 5.5 inches wide. So we've got 22 inch long by 5.5 inch wide rectangles, 2 of those for the straps, and 2 12-inch lengths of a 1/2 inch elastic. And that's going to create a really nice gathered effect on the strap. If you decide that you want to gather just 1.5 times the length of the elastic on your straps, which is what I would do in the future, you need 16.5 inch by 5.5 inch squares. So I'm going to start off by making the straps. You want to fold the pieces in half right sides together along the long edge and stitch that with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. You then turn that loop wrong sides together, so turn it inside out, and you're going to press it with that seam along the center of the loop. You're then going to stitch 5/8 of an inch along each of the long edges, which is going to create a channel for you to thread your elastic into. You then just feed the elastic through that channel, and then you're going to pin that in place either side. And your straps are good to go. Because I'm using French seams on this, I'm always going to start off with the fabric wrong sides together, stitch it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, flip it with right sides together, give it a good press, and then stitch it with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. If you are having pockets like me, you want to start off by stitching a pocket bag to each of the legs on the outside edge. So this has been stitched with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I've pressed it over now right sides together. It can be useful to just clip up to this stitch line here to allow the French seam to sit a little bit flatter. Then I'm going to do my 3/8 of an inch seam allowance just on this pocket bag section. You then want to press the pockets out away from the leg, and we're going to do all the side seams at once. So I've got a front and a back piece that need to be pinned together wrong sides together. It can be helpful to just check the notches to make sure you've got a front and a back piece so that you don't end up stitching 2 front pieces together and 2 back pieces together along the leg seam. And you want to line these up all the way down the inside and the outside of the leg, including all around this pocket bag. I will do both the outside of the pant leg and the inside of the pant leg, pin them both, and stitch them together. And because it's French seams, we're going wrong sides together at first with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you're getting up into this curve here, and even into this curve here, I feel like it's tricky to maintain that right seam allowance, so I am going to just do a chalk marking so that I know what line I'm supposed to be following. When you're sewing, you get to the point where the seam allowance intersects. You want to keep your needle down, lift the foot, pivot, and then sew into the pocket bag. You'll do the same at the top of the pocket too. So I finished off these side seams. I have flipped them and stitched them right sides together, enclosing that seam completely, both for the pocket and for the trouser. You then want to press the side seam to the front, so that pocket is going to sit better, and you can press the inside leg seam to the back. The next thing we need to do is just attach these legs together at the crotch seam. So it is helpful to put one leg inside out, and then you're going to put one pant leg into the other. But remember, French seams, we're going to start off with them wrong sides together, lining it up neatly, pinning at the crotch, stitching at our 1/4 inch seam allowance, flipping it, pressing it, stitching it at 3/8 of an inch with right sides together. And that is essentially a pair of pants with French seams all ready to go. I've got the straps ready as well, so now I just need to make the bodice. Before I go ahead and do the shearing, I always like to finish the top edge because it's a lot easier to do that before it's all sheared and gathered up. So you can make this hem however you want to. You can use a narrow hem foot, you can serge it and stitch it down. My preference is just to fold it a 1/4 inch, stitch it down the center of that, fold it a 1/4 inch again, and stitch down the middle there. I don't do any pressing or any pinning, and I feel like that just works pretty easily for me. Just to show you, this is the finished top edge of my bodice. You don't need to finish the bottom edge because that's going to be attached to your pants. But you can see here the 1 row of stitching visible on the outside of the bodice and 2 rows of stitching on the inside. I tend to start my first row of shirring about 1/2 inch from the finished edge here. It's always really important to backstitch at the beginning of a row because otherwise the shirring elastic might gradually pull out of the garment as you're wearing it. As I'm getting to the end, you might be able to see this line here, which is a chalk mark, which shows me where 5/8 of an inch seam allowance is from the edge. And that edge is going to become my back bodice seam. So instead of back stitching at the beginning and end of every single row, my preference is to just stitch into that seam allowance, keep my needle down, bring my foot up, pivot downward into that seam allowance for 3 or 4 stitches. I can then pivot back again and start stitching my second row as one continuous stitch. I always line up the edge of my sewing machine foot with my previous row of shirring, and that's how wide I make my rows. If you want to be really particular about it, you can draw some chalk lines, but for me this is honestly as even as I think it needs to be. So you're basically just going to keep doing that until the bodice is as long as you want it to be. I think it's always a good idea when you get to a point where you've finished a row, finished a bobbin, to try the bodice in just to double check the length, because it's way easier to add more rows than to take them out if you do more than you need to. And this is my finished sheared bodice piece. So you will notice it gets more gathered as you go. The more rows of shearing you add, the more it gathers up. So I need to turn a strip of sheared fabric into a bodice. So I basically need to make a tube. So to make this a bodice, I am just going to join this short sides together. I'm going to stitch it together, wrong sides together at a 1/4 inch, flip it around, and then sew it at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I do not think it's a good idea to press it for that second stitch this time around, because pressing is going to really shrink up that shirring elastic and make it a lot harder to deal with. In an ideal world, you want to try and line up these rows of shearing. It is going to be the center back seam, so from the outside, theoretically, you might be able to see if they don't line up. But honestly, with all the gathering, there's so much going on, I don't really think it would be obvious, so I wouldn't fuss too much about lining those rows up. I really prefer to sew shearing elastic with French seams because that means that the ends of the elastic are getting sewn in twice, which for me gives a little bit of extra security. You can just make 1 tube of fabric and then do the shirring afterwards, but in my opinion, I don't feel like that's as secure because you're going to have to cut the shirring elastic each row, so there's more chance of it to ping out. But also I feel like as you're getting further into that tube, it gets a little bit crowded around the needle and around your foot in the sewing machine, and I find it generally just way more awkward. One other thing I did is, if you can imagine on this French seam, we had this flap of the seam that was kind of sticking out. So what I did at the top of the bodice is I just folded it over to one side, and then I just tacked it down along the stitch line to get the nice neat edge there. Once you've done that, now you get to give it a good press, and it will definitely shrink up. You will see it get smaller as you're pressing with steam. And now I'm just going to join the bodice onto the trousers. If you have lost track of the front and the back of the trousers, because it is easy to do, always have a look at where the center of the crotch is, and then look at the edge of the waistband. The back crotch curve is always longer than the front, so that's how you're going to know where the back and the front are. So this is shorter, so that's our front. This longer bit is the back. I'm lining up the front and the back seams together, so that way I can work out what is going to be the exact midpoint between those on the side seams. Sometimes it is your side seam, but in this case it's just slightly off of where that is, and that's basically dividing the pants up into 4 equal sections. And then I need to do the same for the bodice. So I just fold the bodice in half with the back seam at one edge. And I know that the front edge, the exact front edge, is going to be opposite. So I stick a pin in there. And then if I fold up the front and the back so that they're opposite each other, I will then know what are the midpoints between those two. So again, I'll be then dividing it into the 4 equal sections for the bodice. If the bottom edge of your bodice is a little bit wobbly after all the shirring, you might want to just trim that off to make it nice and straight, but it just depends how even your rows were. So this is the bottom of the bodice, and I'm going to turn it around so that the right side is inside, so wrong side's out, so that I can match up the wrong side of the bodice with the wrong side of the pants. Remember, we're doing French seams here, so you want to get that center back seam lined up with the center back on the pants. You're going to do the same for the front and then for the ones on the sides. So the way I find easiest to even out these gathers is I'm going to take 2 of the pins, pull the shearing elastic out until the fabric behind it is sitting nice and flat, and then stick a pin at midpoint between them. I then hold on to the new pin and one of the pins I had before, pull it until the fabric is flat, stick a pin at the midpoint, and just keep doing that until it feels nice and secure all the way. So I'm just going to go ahead and stitch this at a 1/4 inch seam allowance wrong sides together, turn it around, press it, and stitch it right sides together at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance for my full French seam. And this is now all attached. So this is the inside, and I'm going to turn it to show you the outside. So all that is left is attaching the straps and doing the hems. So I'm going to try this on with a bra so that I can see where my bra straps are and pin the straps in place over my bra. So I've gone and pinned this so that both the front and the back are covering my bra straps perfectly. The other thing you will want to think about is the length of the strap at this point. So I've pinned it on the outside so I can undo the pin and I can just go ahead and make it a bit tighter just to see if I prefer it that way. It does make it a bit more secure, but then I will say that it does feel tighter and it's going to pull the bodice up a little bit. So I actually preferred where I had it before, so I'm going to go back to there. The other thing you can think about now is this ruffle. So I made this ruffle intentionally 2 times the length of the elastic that is in the channel, but you might want to have a slightly less gathered ruffle. So I'll show you what it would look like if we had more like 1.5 times the length of the elastic. So the elastic is the same length, but it's less of a ruffle. So I'll show you the difference between the two. So this is more like 1.5 the length of the elastic, and this is 2 times the length of the elastic. I think I prefer this, so that's what I'm gonna go for, but I just wanted to show you options because you may prefer for less of a ruffle or more of a ruffle. You could even take the ruffle away completely. So this one I've taken all of that gathering out, so it's just a flat strap. So that's another option if you don't want to have all the ruffling there. I still like to have elastic rather than just having a rigid strap. It's going to make it easier to go on and off over my hips when I'm taking it on and off. But I just personally like that little look. I feel like it ties it together with the gathering of the shirring, but personal preference. Just giving you options. Before you stitch the strap in place, once you know where it needs to be, you want to make sure that it's the right way around. So there is a seam going down the middle that you want to be on the inside of the garment, and you need to make sure that it's not twisted before you stitch it in place. Now I want to make sure these are secure and that I'm enclosing my raw edges. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to mark 5/8 of an inch from the top edge of the bodice on each side of the strap, and I'm going to connect that line going over the strap itself. If you want to be really secure, you can always just do some stitches to tack this elastic into the edge of the strap. I'm using safety pins, but I want to be really careful whenever I'm moving these around or unpinning it that the elastic isn't pinging back into the strap, or you're going to have to feed it through again, which would be a pain. So you want to start off by flipping the strap upside down, kind of like doing a somersault, flipping over, and you're going to match up the chalk lines that are now on the bottom of the strap with the ones that are visible on the bodice itself. So you just need to pin all of this in place. Again, make sure your elastic doesn't ping in, make sure you're holding on tight to the edge of that elastic, and you're gonna stitch that then with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then I need to trim this edge down. You wanna be really careful to make sure that you're keeping the bodice edge out of the way, just to cut as close as you can to that stitch line. I then fold the strap back up again, and then I'm going to stitch it a 1/4 inch from that fold which is going to enclose that edge completely, so a bit like a French seam. If you want to add a sewing label so that you can easily pick out the front and the back of this jumpsuit, this is a good time to do it. If you don't have sewing labels, you can just maybe stitch a piece of ribbon down or something just to make it a little bit easier for yourself. But if you have that seam in the back, it is a French seam, you will always be able to tell. But I just prefer to have it a little bit easier for myself early in the morning when I'm a bit tired. That sewing label just makes it so much easier to get dressed. And I thought this was a good choice for a French seamed shirred jumpsuit. This is an intensely distracted label and it's a fun one. Now that the straps are on, I can try this on and work out where I want to hem it. I'm going for about 3/4 lengths, and I'm going to do the exact same hem on the bottom that I did at the top of the bodice. And that, my friends, is how you make yourself a sheared bodice jumpsuit. I know I've said it before, you know it's true. I am absolutely in love with this jumpsuit. I am so excited with how it turned out. I'm already planning the next one that I want to make, and I really hope that I've inspired some of you to have a go at making this jumpsuit too. If anyone does make it, I would love to hear about it. It would honestly mean the world to me to know that somebody else followed this tutorial and made themselves this amazing jumpsuit. If you do make one, please do let me know in the comments down below. If you share your make on Instagram, please tag me on Instagram. I am lost my thread over there as well, because it would just be so fun to see your lovely creations using this tutorial. If you enjoyed this video today, I really would appreciate you giving it a like. It really helps other people to find my channel, to find my videos. Think about subscribing if you want to see more of my videos in the future, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!